No woman can match me. Not now, not blindfolded, he scoffed, laughing as the audience froze and cameras snapped. But when Eliza Moreno stepped onto that stage, calm and silent, with a silk blindfold tied across her eyes, she didn't just play, she changed the sound of history. What began as an insult became a revolution, as one overlooked woman shattered the arrogance of a legend with nothing but heart, memory, and music that moved the world. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. Women don't have the hand strength or mental discipline for real piano mastery, he said, loud enough for every journalist in the room to hear, his smirk slicing through the air sharper than any tea he'd ever struck. Sebastian Voss leaned back in the velvet-cushioned chair like a man fully convinced of his own invincibility. His voice echoed through the marble-walled press room of the Danforth Conservatory, where gold chandeliers shimmered above like constellations watching the collapse of humility. The room, crowded with industry critics, music journalists, and students from the Academy, fell into a stunned hush. Some gasped, others chuckled nervously, unsure if it was satire. But Sebastian was deadly serious. Eliza Moreno, seated quietly in the second row, stared down at the program in her lap, the edges crinkling beneath her fingers. She didn't move, she didn't blink. She had learned long ago that stillness, graceful, deliberate stillness, was often the loudest protest. But inside, something cracked, like a wine glass too long exposed to heat. A reporter stammered, "Are you saying women can't play at the highest levels?" Sebastian chuckled, the kind of laughter reserved for those who believe the universe exists to orbit them. "I'm saying it's biology, darling, not misogyny. Look at the greats. Horowitz, Gould, Argerich is an exception, but even she wouldn't dare duel me blindfolded. It's physics. It's mental mapping. You can't teach instinct." The cameras snapped furiously. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few eyes turned toward Eliza, but she remained still, her dark eyes unreadable, as if storing the moment in some internal vault where future firestorms were forged. Sebastian continued, casually tossing a silk handkerchief back into his blazer pocket. "I'd gladly duel any female pianist in the world, blindfolded if it makes them feel more equal." The moderator tried to interject, but the damage was done. The sentence had detonated across the room like a grenade wrapped in velvet. On the far side, someone's phone buzzed. Already, the quote was traveling. Eliza stood. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her exit was not dramatic, not rushed, not designed to reclaim a spotlight, but it was felt. Every step across the marble floor clicked like the stroke of a metronome, controlled and deliberate. Behind her, the cameras kept flashing, but no lens could capture the storm rising quietly behind her eyes. That night, social media exploded. The video of Sebastian's statement garnered over 1 million views within 6 hours. The music world was ablaze with commentary, some defending him as a provocateur, most condemning him as the symbol of everything wrong with gatekeeping in classical music. "Eliza Moreno should respond," one user tweeted. "She already did," replied another. "She walked away. Like a queen." But away from the noise, Eliza sat in her modest apartment above a bookstore, hands resting gently on the silent keys of an old upright piano passed down from her mother. She didn't play, not yet. Her mind wasn't on revenge, nor recognition. It was somewhere else, years ago, in the shadow of a concert hall she was never invited into. Eliza's mother had worked nights as a janitor at the Halberstam Academy, one of the most elite music schools in the country. While her mother swept floors and emptied trash bins, Eliza wandered the empty halls, drawn like a moth to the echo of forgotten music. One night, she found it. A Steinway grand in an abandoned recital room, lit only by moonlight through tall stained glass windows. She approached it like a cathedral, and then she played. Not well, not at first, but there was something there, an aching, searching quality, like someone speaking a language they had never heard but somehow already knew. And someone was listening. Professor Aldous Crane, a blind man with snow-white hair and a cane that clicked like a timekeeper on stone, had been resting in a nearby office when he heard her. He didn't interrupt, not that night, but he left a note on the bench the next morning. "If you come again, come without fear, come with intention. Music hears what people refuse to. And she had. Night after night, with his quiet guidance, he never asked her to read music. Instead, he told her to close her eyes and find the silence between the notes. He taught her to play not with her eyes, but with her memory, her hands, her soul. It was Aldous who blindfolded her for the first time, placing a silk scarf across her eyes and whispering, "Now play it like you lived it, not like you learned it." She had forgotten that moment. Until now. Now the memory returned not as a whisper, but as a calling. The next morning, she went for a walk through Madison Park. She needed air. She needed grounding. And that's when it happened. A girl, no older than 10, with curly hair and calloused fingers that hinted at hours of practice, walked up to her with a cautious glance. "Are you the lady he talked about?" Eliza turned slowly. The girl fidgeted with a folded program from the gala concert. "They said, girls can't play like the greats, but my mom said you're the best she's ever heard." Eliza knelt to the girl's level. "What do you think?" The girl didn't answer at first. Then she looked up and said, "I think he's scared of you." Eliza laughed softly, not in amusement but in recognition. The girl wasn't wrong. Not entirely. She stood. Her fingers tingled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not defiance, not pride. Conviction. That night, she sent a simple email to the concert hall's director. "I accept the challenge. Name the stage. 2 pieces. Blindfolded." By morning, it was all over the news. The event was announced within 24 hours. The duel, Voss versus Moreno, live, blindfolded. Tickets sold out in 8 hours. The conservatory's phone lines crashed. Sponsors lined up. Everyone wanted a piece of the spectacle. But for Eliza, it was never about spectacle. It was about sound. About truth. About the echo of that first note she struck under moonlight when no one believed in her name. As the date approached, the pressure intensified. Sebastian gave smug interviews, laughing at the overhype, calling it a stunt designed to soothe the Twitter mob. He promised to wear silk cuffs, just to show how relaxed he was. Meanwhile, Eliza requested a single thing, a blindfold of her own. Not just any fabric, but the same silk scarf Professor Crane once placed over her eyes. In her small apartment, she tied it gently and sat before the piano in silence. No audience, no lights, no cameras, only stillness. Then, one note, then another. Then a storm of sound that had waited years to be heard. And this time, she wouldn't play to prove herself. She would play to undo everything he thought he knew. The lights above the Danforth Concert Hall glowed like a constellation summoned to witness something far greater than music. Banners draped over the marble columns read simply, "The Duel." No subtext, no explanation. The world already knew what was coming. Inside, the hall was electric. Not the polite murmur of a classical audience waiting to be impressed, but the heavy, hungry silence before a storm. People from every circle had gathered. Critics, celebrities, students, veterans of the keys, and those who had never once stepped into a music hall, drawn here by the firestorm that had ignited across the nation. The stage was clean. 2 identical concert grands stood like twin sentinels at opposite ends. In the center, a single stool. A blindfold sat on it like a crown made of silk. Backstage, Eliza adjusted the cuffs of her black dress. Simple, sleeveless, tailored to her body but unadorned. She wore no jewelry, no heels, only flat black shoes, the kind that felt like home to her feet, to the rhythms she knew would soon pour out of them. A knock on the door. It creaked open. 10 minutes, Miss Moreno," came the assistant's voice. She nodded, but her mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was back in that first recital she had ever dared to attend, standing in the back of a great auditorium as a child, too poor for a ticket, watching through the service door as the great Sebastian Voss performed with mechanical brilliance and a face carved from pride. She remembered the way the audience had stood when he rose, how they had bowed to his perfection, how her mother whispered, "He is like stone, flawless but cold." And now that stone was waiting for her. In the opposite dressing room, Sebastian was swirling brandy in a glass he had no intention of drinking. He had already spoken to 3 magazines that week, posing near his piano, commenting on Eliza's raw enthusiasm and how he admired young blood, even if the fingers haven't fully matured. He had even joked on live television, "I hope she's more than a hashtag pianist." But something gnawed at the edge of his composure. He remembered the night of the press conference. Her stillness. The look in her eyes that did not burn with anger, but with something worse. Something patient. Something ancient. And tonight, that silence would sit beside him on stage. They met under the lights at precisely 7 p.m. The stage manager introduced the format. Each pianist would play one piece of their own choosing, and one selected by the other. Both would be performed blindfolded. Judges, 3 world-renowned performers, would evaluate expression, technique, emotional translation, and originality. Sebastian stepped forward first. He removed his jacket with theatrical flair, rolled up his sleeves, and tied the blindfold with the drama of a matador. The crowd watched, amused and curious, as he cracked his knuckles and gave a mock bow toward Eliza. "I'll begin with Rachmaninoff," he said to the microphone, his voice deep, charming, and filled with that poison the world had once called charisma. The first notes dropped like marbles, precise, fast, exact. His fingers glided with confidence over each phrase, cutting through the prelude in G minor with icy control. The audience watched in admiration, but not awe. It was mastery without mystery, perfection without pain. By the time he struck the final chord, the applause was immediate, but not overwhelming. It sounded like what it was, respect, not reverence. He rose, removed the blindfold, and turned toward Eliza. "Your turn," he said softly, as though offering a dare dressed in silk. Eliza said nothing. She stood slowly and approached the bench with reverence, not showmanship. As she sat, she drew from her pocket an old piece of silk, faded, slightly frayed at the corners. The audience could not know its origin, but she did. That scarf had heard more music in the dark than Sebastian had in all his light. She tied it gently over her eyes, and the moment she placed her hands on the keys, the room itself seemed to bend toward her. She began with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement, a piece that begins like quiet desperation and builds into furious defiance. But she did not rush. She touched the first notes as if waking something sleeping inside the wood. Each measure breathed. Each crescendo clawed upward, like a woman rising through grief, breaking through weight, refusing to disappear. She was not playing notes. She was telling a secret she had buried for years beneath rejection and ridicule, and every bar of it was real. A tear slid down the cheek of a judge. The final storm of notes erupted in a cascade, and when it ended, there was no applause. Not for a full 3 seconds, because no one could move. The silence after her performance was its own kind of ovation. Then came the roar. They stood, not politely but instinctively. People screamed her name. Someone dropped a program. One critic dropped his pen and let it roll beneath the seat. Sebastian did not stand. He watched her remove the blindfold with the same silence she had once walked out of his press room. And for a flicker of a second, he knew. She had not come here to win. She had come here to reclaim everything they told her she was never allowed to reach. He clapped, once, twice, then stopped. Backstage, the staff prepared the final round. Eliza would choose the next piece for Sebastian. He waited for a predictable challenge, perhaps Chopin, maybe Debussy, something elegant but standard. Instead, she leaned into the mic and said, "Liszt, La Campanella." There was a visible shift in the room. La Campanella was not just hard, it was hell. A firestorm of leaps, glissandos, and unrelenting speed. It was not designed for calm hands or uncertain minds, and it certainly wasn't the kind of piece you offered someone if you wanted mercy. Sebastian's jaw flexed once. He gave a short bow. "Very well," he said, but he knew. This wasn't a duel anymore, it was a reckoning. As he sat tying the blindfold once more, something inside him trembled. Not panic, but vulnerability. He had never played La Campanella blindfolded, never needed to, never thought he would have to. The music began, and almost instantly he was off. Not fatally, not embarrassingly, but off just enough. He missed a transition, then he rushed to repeat. A fingering slipped. He caught it. But now he was aware. Now he was inside his own head. The confidence cracked. A single bead of sweat slid down his temple. He finished. But it was survival, not performance. And in his heart, he knew what was coming next. She would play the same piece, blindfolded, without fear. And she would not aim to match him. She would aim to transcend him. "You looked nervous," the judge said softly as Sebastian stepped off stage, removing the blindfold with more force than grace. Sebastian forced a smile, the kind stretched too tightly across a face that no longer believed in it. "Out of practice with that one, not my usual Liszt tempo." The judge didn't respond. Not with words, just a slow nod that said more than silence. And silence tonight was everywhere. Eliza remained in the wings, her hands clasped in front of her like a prayer not yet spoken. She had watched every twitch of his hands, every stutter of breath between the phrases. She'd counted not the mistakes, but the fear inside them. For once, Sebastian Voss had played like a man trying not to fail instead of a master daring to fly. And now, it was her turn. She walked onto the stage with the quiet gravity of someone attending a memorial, not a match. The crowd settled, the way oceans do when the storm has passed and something vast is about to rise from the deep. She paused before the piano bench and untied her scarf with reverence. Then she sat, lifted it again, and bound her eyes once more. But this time, it wasn't just a blindfold. It was a veil over the past, over every rejection letter, every backhanded compliment, every time someone said for a woman after praising her skill. Over the nights she wasn't invited, the festivals where her name was omitted, the judges who called her unrefined, all of it. She exhaled and played. The opening notes of La Campanella spilled from her hands like glass bells dropped into water, crisp, pure, impossibly precise. The audience barely breathed. There was no hesitation, no clumsy recalibration like Sebastian's, only clarity. But it wasn't the precision that stopped hearts, it was the phrasing. She didn't just play the piece, she reimagined it. Instead of treating it like a fiery technical sprint, she let the melody float above the chaos, a ballerina pirouetting on the tip of a tornado. The rippling arpeggios weren't just flourishes, they were stories, questions, answers. At one point, a passage known for its blistering speed arrived, but instead of racing through it like a metronome addict, Eliza slowed it down, just enough to pull a breath from it, like catching a falling snowflake before it hit the ground. The judges looked at one another, astonished. One whispered, "She's rewriting Liszt mid-performance." She was, and it was working. The crowd leaned in, some with eyes closed, others with hands clasped as though in worship. A child in the front row began to cry, not out of fear or sadness, but the way people cry when they encounter something too beautiful to name. Sebastian watched from the shadows, arms folded, but no longer smug. There was something soft in his gaze now, something foreign, something he hadn't felt in years. Awe. Eliza reached the climax of the piece, her fingers dancing so quickly and gracefully that they appeared to vanish beneath the light. And all the while, she was blindfolded, seeing only the map she'd built in her soul over decades of being ignored. She struck the final note like a question mark hanging in the sky. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't end with applause. The kind that hovers in the chest and refuses to move. The kind that transforms people. And when the audience finally remembered their voices, they didn't cheer. They erupted. The ovation surged from the seats like a wave crashing through marble. People screamed, stomped, sobbed. The judges rose, one by one, their faces stunned, broken open by something they couldn't name but would never forget. Eliza sat motionless at the bench for just a moment longer, the blindfold still covering her eyes. Then she slowly reached up, untied it, and blinked into the light. But she didn't smile. She stood, bowed deeply, not to the audience but to the piano, and left the stage. Not once did she look at Sebastian, not because she didn't care, but because she no longer needed to. Backstage, the press surged toward her, shouting questions. "What message do you have for Mr. Voss? Was this about gender equality? Did you expect to win?" She raised a hand, not to silence them, but to calm the noise. Then she said softly, "Tonight wasn't about beating him. It was about becoming who I've always been. The music never doubted me. I was just waiting for the world to catch up." The next day, the headlines circled the globe. Blindfolded pianist stuns the world. Voss humbled as Moreno redefines virtuosity. She didn't just play Liszt, she freed it. And perhaps most poignantly, from a quiet music blog, "We thought we came to watch a duel. What we witnessed was the crowning of a queen who never needed a crown." Sebastian made no further public comments. He canceled the rest of his tour and retreated from the spotlight, reportedly entering a months-long silence to reevaluate his relationship with music. Eliza, on the other hand, didn't rush into endorsements or tours. She returned to the small bookstore apartment, to the upright piano, to the quiet street where no one had known her name, and now everyone did. But she still practiced blindfolded, not because she had to, because it reminded her that even in the dark, she could create light. The crowd didn't want to leave. Even after Eliza had walked off stage, the echoes of her final note lingered like mist clinging to the rafters. People milled about in the marble aisles of the concert hall, wide-eyed, clutching programs as if they had just witnessed something too sacred to fold away. Some had tears in their eyes. Others spoke in hushed tones, not wanting to disturb what they had just experienced. In a hallway behind the stage, Eliza stood with her back against the cool stone wall, breathing deeply. Not from exertion. Her hands, though tired, still tingled with quiet energy, but from something deeper. She had not anticipated the silence after the storm to feel so loud. A production assistant approached her carefully, like someone nearing a sleeping tiger. "Miss Moreno, the judges would like to speak to you. In private." Eliza blinked, then nodded. She followed the assistant down a quiet corridor, every step echoing like punctuation between chapters. They entered a side room lit by soft, golden sconces, where the three judges stood waiting, their expressions grave but warm. The eldest of them, Maestro Kroll, a titan in the world of European classical music, stepped forward first. His voice was gentle, like a bow drawn softly across a cello. "I have taught Liszt, performed him for decades, but tonight," his voice faltered. "Tonight you gave him a voice I never knew he had." Eliza said nothing. Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to praise spoken like confession. The second judge, a stern woman known for her brutal honesty, simply extended her hand. "Not just technique," she said. "Emotion, courage, vulnerability. We weren't judging a competition tonight. We were witnessing the arrival of something we don't have a word for yet." The third judge, younger, leaned forward. "Where did you learn to phrase like that, to pull time apart like thread?" Eliza hesitated, then answered quietly, "I was taught by someone who couldn't see the keys, so he taught me to hear the space between them." The room fell still, and then one by one the judges bowed, not as performers, not as critics, but as students who had just been humbled. She left the room without fanfare. Across the hall, Sebastian sat alone in his dressing room, staring at his hands. They looked the same as they always had, long, strong, precise, but for the first time in his life, they felt like someone else's. As if they had betrayed him. Or worse, revealed him. He had no excuses left. No technicality to hide behind. She had played his challenge blindfolded and transformed it into something bigger than him. He had offered war. She gave rebirth. Sebastian looked at the piano in the corner and, without thinking, reached for the blindfold still folded beside it. He stared at it for a long time, then quietly left the room without putting it on. Outside, the street was flooded with cameras. Reporters clamored for statements. Fans waved at Eliza as she exited, but she paused only briefly to smile at the little girl from the park. The same one who had once said, "I think he's scared of you." Tonight, the girl didn't say a word. She just held up a hand-painted sign that read, "She played in the dark and lit up the world." Eliza smiled, placed her hand over her heart, and disappeared into the city. The next day, her name was on every screen, every article, every morning show, but not in the way she feared. They didn't turn her into a spectacle. They turned her into a signal that the mold had cracked, that the gatekeepers had fallen asleep, and the music had found its own door. Interviews poured in from every corner of the globe. Record labels called, talk shows begged, invitations arrived from conservatories that once ignored her applications. Even her old academy, the one her mother used to clean at night, sent her a letter. Not a contract, not a job offer, an apology. Eliza didn't respond immediately. She took long walks, played piano with the windows open, bought sheet music for composers she'd never heard of. She didn't need to race. The world had finally turned to face her, and she had no interest in chasing it. A week later, she received a message unlike the rest. It was handwritten, from Professor Aldous Crane. She hadn't heard from him in over a year. Age had slowed his fingers and his health had weakened. But the letter was strong. "Eliza, you did not just play music that night. You returned music to itself. You reminded it what it was before it was performance, when it was still prayer. And you reminded me why I ever taught in the first place. If I hear one more note in this life, I'm grateful it was yours." Tears blurred the ink as she folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. A few days later, an announcement stunned the music world. Eliza Moreno had agreed to give a single encore performance, not at Carnegie, not in Berlin, but at the tiny recital hall of the Halberstam Academy, the same place she had once snuck into as a child, the same institution that had once looked through her like smoke. But this time, she wouldn't be playing as a student, or even a guest. She would be playing as the new artist in residence. When she entered the hall for the first time as a featured artist, the custodial staff stood in the lobby waiting. One of them, an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and a crooked name badge, approached her slowly. "You're Rosalie Moreno's daughter, aren't you?" Eliza turned, startled. "My mother. Yes, you knew her?" The woman nodded. "She used to sneak in and sit in the back when you played at night. She told me once, 'My girl plays like she's trying to build a world better than this one.'" Eliza's lips parted, trembling. "I never knew she watched." "She never wanted you to know." The woman smiled. "Said it might make you play safer." Eliza laughed gently through the ache in her chest. She was right. That night the recital hall was filled beyond capacity, not with critics or elite donors, but with students, janitors, cafeteria workers, parents, people who remembered what music could do before it was bought and sold. She walked onto the stage with no fanfare. She sat, she tied the scarf over her eyes once again, and she began to play. Not to prove, not to win, but to heal. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something ancient awakened. The recital hall was not vast, no marble columns, no velvet drapery, just plain walls that had once absorbed the indifference of gatekeepers, the silence of the overlooked. But tonight, the walls were listening, and more than that, they were remembering. Eliza's blindfold had become a kind of truth serum. Without the glare of lights or expectation, her soul rose freely, stripped of performance, untouched by spectacle. Her playing was gentle at first. A melody that felt like sunrise through a window no one knew was there. It was her own composition, never written down. It came from somewhere behind memory, soft, sorrowful, defiant. The audience did not clap when it ended. They wept. A girl in the second row wiped her nose on her sleeve, then clutched her mother's hand. A custodian stood frozen near the back door, mop bucket untouched, eyes wide with something like reverence. Eliza removed the blindfold slowly, blinking into the dim golden lights. Then she spoke, not into a microphone, not to command attention, but as if confessing a secret. "My mother once told me, 'When you don't have the power to speak, let your fingers say it for you.'" No applause followed, just a silence so complete it was louder than thunder. And then, without cue, the audience rose to its feet, not to cheer, but to honor. For Eliza Moreno, that night was not a performance, it was reclamation. A week passed, then two. Eliza declined commercial deals, ignoring multi-million-dollar offers to license her name to a perfume, a fashion label, even a luxury piano brand. She agreed instead to one thing, to teach. Not full-time, just on Saturdays, to children whose families had never even touched a piano key. "I want to build players," she told the director, "not products." Meanwhile, in a quiet stone house tucked away from the city, Sebastian Voss watched the footage of Eliza's encore performance late into the night. Over and over. Not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the pained awe of a man hearing an echo of something he used to feel and had long forgotten. He had not played since the duel. His fingers remained capable, his ears still sharp, but something inside him had fallen silent. Not broken. No, that would have been easier. What he felt was not collapse, but hollowness. The terrifying realization that he had spent his life chasing mastery and had somehow missed meaning. He stared at the piano across the room like it was a stranger. One afternoon, without telling anyone, Sebastian visited the music academy where Eliza now taught. He arrived unannounced, dressed plainly in a navy coat and worn shoes. No entourage, no cameras, no fanfare. He watched through the glass of the practice room as Eliza guided a small girl with trembling hands through a basic chord progression. She did not correct with harshness. She encouraged with stories. "This chord," she said softly, resting her hand on the girl's shoulder. "This one sounds like a question you're afraid to ask, so play it like that." The girl tried again. The sound was imperfect, but alive. Sebastian stepped back from the window before she could see him. He walked the halls of the academy for a while, letting the sounds of music, real, messy, beautiful music, fill the empty places inside him. That night, for the first time in months, he sat at his piano. Not to rehearse, not to record, to remember. He placed a scarf over his eyes. Not Eliza's scarf, not a showy blindfold, just a piece of black cloth from a forgotten drawer, and touched the keys. The notes were hesitant at first, then firmer, then broke like waves. He cried as he played. Not because the music was sad, but because it was honest. In the months that followed, Sebastian withdrew from concert tours. He issued no public statement, only a single interview, in which he said, "It took someone playing in the dark to help me see how blind I had been, with my eyes wide open. Eliza taught me that brilliance isn't loud, it listens." The two of them did not speak directly for nearly a year, not out of animosity, but because some echoes take time to settle before new notes can begin. When they finally did meet again, it was not in a concert hall or a gala, but in a small community center in New Orleans, where Eliza had launched a free piano program for underprivileged children. The center was old, peeling paint clinging to its edges, but inside, light. Sebastian arrived quietly. She was helping a boy with Down syndrome find middle C on an electric keyboard. When she looked up and saw him, their eyes met. No words, then a slow, genuine smile. He approached, placing a soft-bound notebook on the table beside her. "New pieces?" she asked. "New beginnings," he replied. She opened it. Inside, compositions unlike anything he'd written before. Gentle, introspective, titles like Learning to Listen, For the Janitor's Daughter, and In the Silence Between Us. "They're not for me to play," he said. "Then who are they for?" "You," he said, "or your students, or anyone who's ever been told they weren't enough." She closed the notebook carefully, like sealing a letter full of memory. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat side by side at the upright piano in the back of the room, just two artists who had finally stopped pretending. And together, without blindfolds, they began to play. Not a duel. A duet. It was not recorded, it was not streamed, no audience, no critics, just music, real, raw, alive. And in that moment, there was no longer an arrogant pianist and the woman who had proved him wrong. There was only the sound of redemption, played slowly between keys once used as weapons, and now as bridges. It began with one child. Her name was Myra, 7 years old, hair like a blooming cloud, hands too small to reach an octave, and a voice that had never dared to speak above a whisper. Her mother brought her into the community piano program on a rainy Saturday, wringing out her coat sleeves and apologizing for not having shoes with proper soles. Eliza welcomed them without question. She had seen that kind of posture before, the quiet shame of those who carry too much and still ask for too little. She knelt beside Myra, handed her a polished key ring in the shape of a treble clef, and said, "This is yours now. When you walk in here, you're not asking permission. You already belong." It was a sentence Myra would repeat in her journal for years to come. There were others too, dozens, then hundreds. Children who had never touched an instrument, teens who had been expelled from conservatories for not fitting in, seniors who carried regrets like folded concert tickets never used. The room filled week after week, not with talent, but with hunger. Not with polished performers, but with aching, trembling hope. Eliza saw it all. She watched how hands that once trembled found steadiness in music, how fingers calloused by labor learned to soften, how students with broken hearts played lullabies for themselves, and quietly, faithfully, she listened. She became more than a mentor, more than a musician. She became a guardian of the unseen. And still, she refused to elevate herself above them. She wore simple clothes, took the bus, tuned the donated pianos herself, declined invitations to award shows that would have handed her trophies because she didn't need another pedestal. She was building ladders. One morning, as winter wrapped the city in glassy breath, Eliza arrived early to the community center. She carried a thermos of coffee and a small worn envelope. Inside was a letter from a girl named Ava, one of her first students, who had moved to Paris on a scholarship arranged by an anonymous donor. The letter was short and written in shaky French-English hybrid. "Madam Eliza, I played the piece you taught me in class. They cried. They all cried. Even the man who wears only black and never claps, he clapped. I am not afraid anymore. Love, Ava." Eliza pressed the letter to her lips. The weight of it was more than paper. It was proof that music had roots, and those roots had reached across oceans. Later that evening, she performed a piece Ava had written, Blindfolded at a local fundraiser. It was a small crowd, parents, neighbors, retired musicians. But when she played Ava's piece, titled Rain Never Asked for Permission, something shimmered in the room. They didn't just hear the music, they heard Ava in it. And in doing so, they heard themselves. Eliza's influence began to spread not through virality, but through intimacy. Through whispered stories at kitchens and street corners, through videos shakily recorded on phones, not studio cameras, through piano keys played in empty churches, hospital lobbies, homeless shelters, wherever sound could still rise above sorrow. It was not long before letters came from schools, small, rural, forgotten schools, asking if she could visit, if she could show their students that art wasn't just for the elite, that pianos weren't just for prodigies in gowns and gloves. She said yes, every time. She performed on cracked instruments, in drafty gymnasiums, in town halls where the stage tilted slightly to the left and the audience was 2 feet from the keys. And always blindfolded. Not for spectacle, but as a reminder. Let your ears lead, she told them. Let your heart follow. Meanwhile, in the corners of her world, quiet revolution stirred. A boy named Khalil, who once refused to speak due to severe anxiety, composed his first piece for his grandmother's funeral. He performed it with shaking hands at her memorial, blindfolded, as Eliza watched from the back row, unseen, and wept. A woman named Caroline, who had lost her husband in a fire and hadn't left her apartment in 2 years, began to attend lessons just to listen. By the end of the semester, she was composing lullabies based on her husband's old humming and performing them at local hospice centers. A janitor named Ramon, who had cleaned floors at a performing arts school for 23 years, was finally invited to play his own music on the same stage he once swept because Eliza had heard him humming to himself late one night and insisted he share. These were not viral moments, they were sacred ones. And yet, the world couldn't help but notice. One day, as Eliza arrived early to unlock the community center, she found a small crowd waiting. Not students, journalists. At the front stood a woman from a major national magazine, holding a notebook and looking nervous. "We'd like to feature you," she said hesitantly. "Not for your past performance, but for this, for what you've built. It's changing things." Eliza looked at the crowd of press, then at the windows where children were already lining up with their lunch pails and sheet music, unaware of the flashbulbs aimed at the door. She said, "If you want to talk, stay the day. Sit in on lessons, play something, but don't write about me." The reporter blinked. "Then who should we write about?" Eliza opened the door and pointed at the first child who walked in carrying a cracked keyboard under his arm. Him. That article went viral, not because of her face, but because it told the stories of the students. It quoted their music, described their lives, showed the crooked, glorious truth of what happens when someone dares to believe that the keys are for everyone. Meanwhile, across the city, across the country, and across the world, a movement began to stir. Music schools reevaluated their admission policies. Auditions began allowing blindfolded submissions. Foundations that once only supported classical elites started funding grassroots art programs in underserved areas. They called it the Moreno method. She never trademarked it. She never even acknowledged the name. She just kept teaching. And sometimes late at night, when the center was quiet and the city breathed in low hums of sirens and streetlight flickers, she would sit at the upright piano near the window, place the silk blindfold across her eyes, and play something just for the dark. Not for the world, not even for the children, but for the girl she once was, the one sitting cross-legged outside a concert hall window, listening through the cold glass, dreaming of a sound she had no name for. Now that sound belonged to everyone. The invitation arrived not with flourish, but with quiet dignity. A sealed envelope pressed into her hand by an old courier who looked at her as if he already knew the answer before she'd even opened it. She sat on the steps of the community center beneath the dull winter sun and turned the envelope in her hands. It was cream-colored, thick with weight, bearing no logo, only her name, written in deep blue ink as though each letter were part of a sonata. Inside, a simple letter. "Dear Miss Moreno, the Vienna Philharmonic requests your presence as guest of honor at the World Musicians Summit, not to perform, not to compete, but to be celebrated. We invite you to receive the honorary key of sound, bestowed only once every generation, to those whose music changes the world. A seat will be reserved for you at center stage. Should you wish it, the stage will also be yours. In gratitude, the committee. Eliza read it twice, then once more. She let the letter rest in her lap, looking out at the children rushing inside the center behind her. Someone had dropped a folder of sheet music, pages fluttering like startled birds across the pavement. She smiled faintly, then rose to help gather them. The letter sat unopened beside her coffee mug for 2 days. She told no one. It wasn't that she was afraid, it was that she was full. Her life was no longer a climb, it was a garden. And she was reluctant to leave its soil, even for gold. But then something happened. A phone call. From the hospital. Professor Aldous Crane, her mentor, her compass, the first person to ever call her a pianist, had suffered a stroke. She flew out that evening, her suitcase packed hastily, her blindfold tucked inside a scarf she'd worn for years. When she arrived at the small care facility tucked in the misty hills of Oregon, the nurse greeted her gently, her tone reverent. "He asked for you. No one else. We don't know how much time." Eliza entered the room slowly. Aldous lay in bed, pale and still, his hands folded like broken wings. His eyes, though sightless, shifted the moment he heard her steps. "Eliza," he rasped. "Is it raining?" "No," she whispered, sitting beside him. "Just soft wind through the trees." "Sounds like rain," he smiled weakly. "You remember what I told you about silence?" She nodded. "It's the beginning of everything." He turned his head toward her voice. "And what do you do with it?" "You honor it, then you answer it." He sighed, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching. "You did, my girl. You answered silence with music so true. It taught the silence how to listen back." Tears fell down her cheeks. "I still don't feel finished." "You're not. But you're whole. And there's a difference." A long pause. Then his lips moved again, barely a whisper. "One more." She leaned in. "What?" "One more performance for the world, so they remember. Not your face, not your fame, but your sound." She held his hand tightly. "But you won't be there." "Yes, I will," he whispered. "If you play Blindfolded, I'll hear it first." He died 3 days later. She stayed with him until the end, playing for him as the light faded. Simple pieces, familiar ones, fragments of things she used to fumble through in the empty halls of Halberstam. He did not speak again. But once, just before dawn, she swore she saw his fingers move in time with her rhythm. She returned to the city changed, not broken, sharpened. She stood before the mirror in her apartment, the scarf laid before her like a vow, and stared into her own eyes as if daring them to blink. And then she wrote back to Vienna, "I will come. I will not speak, but I will play, blindfolded, for the one who taught me how." The concert hall in Vienna was a jewel of the old world. Gold leaf ceilings, rows of red velvet, a stage carved from centuries of ghosts. No one had performed there blindfolded in living memory. The announcement caused a storm. Newspapers across Europe screamed her name. Invitations tripled. Seats vanished in hours. Political figures, royal guests, musical prodigies, everyone was coming. But Eliza said no interviews, no photos, no dress rehearsals, just the piano and the blindfold. The night arrived cloaked in frost. Vienna glittered like a frozen crown. Eliza entered through the service entrance by choice, not because she had to, but because that's how she'd first entered every stage of her life. The hall fell silent as she stepped under the lights. She wore no diamonds, no gown, only a black dress and the blindfold in her hand. She said nothing. She sat, she tied it, and then she began. But this was not Liszt, not Beethoven, not Chopin. This was Aldous Crane. She played his piece, the one he had once hummed under his breath while she tried to mimic it in the dark. She had reconstructed it from memory, from instinct, from a place beneath grief and above language. The opening notes were like hands reaching into cold water, searching, then slowly, finding. A hush fell so heavy across the audience that even tears didn't dare fall too loudly. The melody spiraled, weaving fragments of childhood, echoes of janitor keys, the hum of brooms against stone floors, the click of a blind man's cane in an empty academy. Every phrase carried someone lost, every rest held someone waiting, and in the final bars, the silence returned. Not absence, not emptiness, but arrival. Eliza lifted her fingers from the keys and removed her blindfold. Her eyes were closed. When they opened, the audience rose as one, not roaring, not clapping in frenzy, but standing in reverent stillness. As if a cathedral had just exhaled, she bowed once and left the stage with nothing in her hands, not even the scarf. She left it on the piano bench for the next player to find. They said Vienna had never sounded so still. The echo of her final note hung in the rafters of the concert hall for days. Not literally, of course, but in the way legends linger, whispering in the bones of buildings, curling around chandeliers like ghosts too tender to frighten. Critics couldn't find the words, and perhaps for the first time that was exactly the point. They didn't need to describe it. They had heard it, they had felt it, and the world, already aching for something it couldn't name, reached out for what she had offered. Eliza didn't attend the gala dinner afterward. While dignitaries clinked glasses and gave speeches about legacy, she was already on a quiet red-eye flight home. Head leaned against the window, scarf folded neatly in her lap. She didn't need to stay. The music had said what it came to say. When she arrived back in the city, it was just before dawn. The sky was a slate canvas. The world hushed, waiting for color. She walked from the train station as if taking a cab, letting the cold wind brush her skin like memory. On the corner of 43rd and Hayworth, a street musician was setting up his keys beneath a flickering street lamp. He was hunched, fingers stiff, but still smiling at the morning. She placed a folded note into his coffee cup as she passed. Inside was a handwritten melody, one she had composed on the plane. Title: For Those Who Play While the World Sleeps. Back at the community center, her absence had been felt, not like the loss of a leader, but like the pause in a song you didn't realize you were waiting to hear again. The children flocked to her as she stepped through the door, arms full of questions, laughter, and half-finished compositions. But they didn't ask about Vienna, they asked about Saturday. Because Saturday meant rehearsal, and Saturday meant home. Eliza tucked away the honors, the letters from presidents, the invitation to headline at Carnegie. Not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't define. What mattered was Khalil's tremor was fading. What mattered was Myra had written her first full composition and titled it Broomstick Waltz, in honor of Eliza's mother. What mattered was that a father who had never cried stood at the back of the room last week and wept silently as his son played Ode to the Woman Who Stayed. But even as the small stories bloomed, something vast was shifting. A conservatory in Switzerland reached out to request permission to adopt her blindfold audition policy, allowing prospective students to perform anonymously. She granted it with one condition: that every applicant receive written feedback, whether they were accepted or not. 2 weeks later, 27 schools across Europe followed. Then South America. Then the Pacific. A young girl in Lagos was offered a full scholarship after her blindfolded rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune went viral, played on a makeshift keyboard painted onto a plank of wood. The donors? Former students of Eliza's who had pooled their savings in secret. At the Metropolitan Hall of Music in New York, a plaque was installed beside their grandest piano. It read, "She did not play to be seen. She played so the unheard could be felt." In honor of Eliza Moreno, she didn't visit the unveiling. Instead, she spent that day with a student named Sophia, who had gone mute after a house fire. Sophia could not speak, but she could play. And Eliza had promised her, "When you're ready, the world will listen, not for your voice, but for your soul." In that dusty room while the cameras flashed downtown, Sophia played Ashes and Echoes for the first time. Eliza did not cry. She bowed, and then asked her to play it again, this time slower. But not everyone welcomed the change. There were institutions that resisted, famous names who rolled their eyes. A radio host scoffed during a broadcast, "We're now letting feelings guide technique. Should we blindfold surgeons next?" A week later, his daughter performed Blindfolded at a youth recital and dedicated the piece to "My dad who thinks I'm only good with my eyes open." The room erupted. The clip went viral. The father issued a public apology. And still, Eliza said nothing. She didn't clap back. She didn't debate. She taught. She listened. She waited. And the world kept turning. Sebastian Voss, too, returned, slowly, carefully, from his self-imposed silence. He no longer headlined grand tours. He didn't give interviews. Instead, he appeared unannounced at small venues, sitting in with student ensembles, offering mentorship without cameras. He played differently now. Not with less precision, but with more humility, more breath between notes. At one such appearance in Berlin, he took the stage to quiet applause and opened with a dedication. For the woman who taught me that silence is not absence, and that brilliance does not require noise. He played a piece she had once written in the margins of a child's notebook. He played it blindfolded. When word reached Eliza, she was in a classroom with 3 students, working through a messy chord progression that kept crumbling in their hands. She listened, smiled faintly, and told them, again, but this time, leave room between the notes. One of them asked, for what? She replied, for the person listening. They'll fill it with something only they can hear. That evening, after the students left and the building settled into its night sound, a mix of distant traffic, ticking heaters, and the creak of old wood, Eliza sat at the upright piano near the window and played something soft, not for an audience, not for a recording, but for Aldous, for her mother, for herself. The notes drifted upward into the quiet like prayers folded into feathers. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, deliberate, holy. And in a world that had once turned its back on her, everything was now listening. The challenge did not arrive with malice. It arrived with brilliance. A single video. A girl, no older than 22, seated at a polished black Bosendorfer in a studio illuminated only by the silver drip of spotlights. She wore gloves, not for theatrics, but for protection. Her fingers were wrapped in gauze, stiff from overuse, and yet they moved like water across fire. She played Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, a piece so nightmarishly difficult it was said to have broken the wills of masters. But she didn't just conquer it, she devoured it. Tore through it with precision and fury and emotion so raw it cracked the recording at its highest peak. And then she spoke, turning toward the camera with a voice trembling not with doubt, but with certainty. I respect Eliza Moreno, but I refuse to worship silence. I don't need blindfolds. I don't need pity. I need challenge, real challenge. And if she's truly the future of music, she should meet the present. Her name was Isadora Lane, and the world listened. Within hours, the video had gone viral, not because of scandal, but because of stakes, because it had been years since anyone had dared to invoke Eliza's name in comparison, let alone defiance. Critics divided. Some called Isadora a prodigy, others a provocateur. She's not insulting Eliza, one host insisted. She's inviting her to speak again, in her own language, music. Still, the world watched Eliza. Waited for a response. She gave none, at least not with words. Instead, she quietly called a friend, a composer who had once studied under Aldous Crane, and asked a single question. Is there a piece that has never been performed blindfolded before? He laughed. Thousands. She smiled. Choose the hardest one. A month later, the broadcast was announced. 1 stage, 2 pianists, no orchestra, no judges, just sound. It was to be aired live across 47 countries, not as a competition, as a conversation, and the world held its breath. Eliza walked into the concert hall with no entourage, no makeup crew, no rehearsals. She wore dark jeans, a soft cream blouse, and the same scarf she had left on the bench in Vienna, returned to her months later by a student who had found it and wept when they realized whose it was. Isadora arrived in red. A sleek dress that shimmered like liquid defiance, her short hair pulled, her eyes focused. She was not cruel, not dismissive, but fierce. And clearly ready to claim her space in the galaxy, Eliza had helped expand. They did not speak before the performance. They bowed and took their seats. Isadora played first. The piece was Prokofiev's Toccata in D minor, a relentless machine of sound built on jagged edges and impossible speed. She attacked it with fire, her gloved fingers rising like lightning, never once faltering. It was not a plea, it was a declaration. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. And then, silence. Eliza stepped forward. The lights dimmed slightly, not for drama, but for focus. She tied her blindfold slowly, carefully, and then placed her hands on the keys. The piece she chose was obscure, Sorabji's Opus Clavicembolisticum, a monster of a composition, 20 minutes long, once deemed unperformable by critics for its labyrinthine structure and emotional demands. She began softly, too softly some thought, but then it rose, note by note, theme by theme. Eliza didn't race through it. She let the complexity breathe, sculpted each passage with a grace so effortless it felt like remembering something you'd never known you knew. The crowd leaned forward. Isadora stared, not with resentment, but wonder. Because Eliza wasn't responding with attack. She was offering welcome. She was saying, "There is room for you here. Even if you shout, even if you burn." Halfway through, the stage seemed to disappear. The cameras vanished. The world melted into the space between two women, connected not by rivalry, but by love so ferocious it demanded expression. When Eliza struck the final chord, her hands hovered in the air, then fell into her lap like petals. She didn't bow. She simply removed the blindfold and turned to Isadora with a soft smile. Isadora blinked, lips trembling. She stood, walked to Eliza, and fell to her knees. "I thought you were quiet because you were done," she whispered, eyes glassy. Eliza knelt beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm quiet because I'm listening." They stood together, and without prompt, without script, walked back to the bench and played four hands on the same keys, blindfolded. A duet born of fire and stillness. Broadcast live. Unrehearsed. Unforgettable. That night, across the globe, young musicians recorded themselves playing blindfolded. Some in basements, others in bedrooms. One child in Bangladesh used a keyboard drawn in chalk. Another in Argentina performed on overturned pots and pans. They called it the listening movement. And it began not with protest, but with permission. Permission to express, to stumble, to feel. Eliza did not return to the stage after that, not because she feared it, but because it was no longer hers alone. She had passed the torch without ever letting go of the flame. She never announced her retirement. She simply stopped showing up where the world expected her to be. There were no farewell tours, no interviews, no emotional tributes under golden spotlights. One day she was at a youth workshop in Detroit, helping a teenage boy with stage fright navigate Chopin with trembling hands. The next, she was gone. Her apartment emptied. Her piano left untouched in the corner, covered with a single linen cloth and a folded letter atop it. Music belongs to the ones who dare to hear it before anyone else does. The world noticed, of course. They called it the Great Disappearance. Articles speculated. Had she moved abroad? Fallen ill? Some even whispered she had gone completely deaf and didn't want the pity. But there were no answers, only traces. A signed note left in the breast pocket of a violinist after a school recital. A worn, annotated score of Satie's Gymnopédie mailed anonymously to a hospice in Vermont. A grand piano donated to a Navajo reservation, accompanied by a simple message carved into the wood, for the sound beneath the silence. Years passed. And still, her name pulsed through the veins of the music world, not like a celebrity, but like a prayer. Institutions, once dominated by gatekeeping and pedigree, now posted signs above their doors. Blindfolded submissions welcome. Orchestras restructured their audition protocols. Conservatories created scholarships in her name, not for the best, but for the unheard. But the most astonishing changes didn't come from the top. They came from playgrounds, from living rooms, from street corners where children played pianos made of cardboard and dreams. And then, one autumn morning, it happened. A video, grainy handheld, posted by a girl no older than 10 with the username @Moreno scores my mama. It showed an old woman seated at a beat-up upright piano in the corner of a small public library. The woman was dressed in a simple coat, her silver hair pinned into a loose bun. Her hands were frail, but they floated over the keys like falling leaves. The song? Not a famous composition. A lullaby. Soft. Original. Familiar in the way sunrises are familiar, even though they're never quite the same twice. And she was blindfolded. At first, no one believed it. Surely not. Too thin, too quiet, too ordinary. But as the melody reached its final note and the woman leaned forward, pressing her hand gently to the piano, the scarf slipped slightly, revealing a flash of patterned silk that had been seen only in legends. The comments exploded. Is it really her? The scarf? That's the scarf. I thought she was gone. She is. But her sound isn't. The video amassed millions of views in days. But there were no follow-ups, no press conferences. The account went silent. The old woman vanished once again. And yet, she was everywhere. One teacher claimed she'd met her on a cross-country train, disguised as a folk musician with a beat-up mandolin. A security guard in Florence swore he saw her guiding a blind student through scales in the echoing arches of a museum hallway. A 6-year-old boy in Tokyo said a strange woman helped him find middle C in a piano store before disappearing into the rain. None of it confirmed. All of it believed. Her name became less a figure and more a language. People stopped saying, "Play it perfectly." They started saying, "Play it like Eliza," which meant play it honestly, play it scared, play it with your whole life trembling behind every note. Then came the final letter. It arrived at the Halberstam Academy on the first day of spring, tucked inside an envelope with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note and a USB drive. The letter read, "To whomever still keeps the lights on in the place where I first heard silence sing, this isn't a legacy, it's a reminder. There's still more to hear. Eliza." They played the file in the auditorium. A new composition, piano only, unscored, unnamed. It began with the sound of a child breathing, then a single note, then another. Slowly, the piece unfolded into a melody stitched together by fragments of lullabies, hymns, sobs, laughter, and long pauses where the silence was louder than anything else. No one moved until it ended. Even after the room emptied, the janitor sat alone in the back row, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, whispering, "She came back for one last song." Years later, when the Academy built a new wing dedicated to creative music education, they didn't name it after her. They didn't need to. They called it the listening room. And on a plaque by the door, carved into brass, she taught us how to play without seeing. She reminded us to hear what no one else would. And in doing so, she turns silence into legacy. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind hums against windows, someone, somewhere, still ties a blindfold. They sit at their piano, take a breath, and begin. Not to impress, not to win, but to speak. Because long ago, one woman sat down before a world that didn't believe she belonged, covered her eyes, and played until they listened. Now, we all do. If you've ever been told you're not enough because of your gender, your background, or your silence, remember Eliza Moreno. She didn't shout back. She didn't argue. She played. And in doing so, she taught the world to listen without needing to see. The greatest power doesn't always come from raising your voice. It comes from owning your gift, even when no one believes you deserve to hold it. So play your song, speak your truth, and if they still won't listen, close your eyes and let the silence carry your sound.